Hello! Our journey into Western philosophy begins with Socrates, who lived from about 470 to about 399 BCE, which was actually pretty quickly after the death of both Confucius and Buddha. Although there's no reason for thinking that any of the three of them would have been familiar with one another, given that there was no internet or mail system or airplanes or whatever connecting the ancient world back then to be able to find out what other people were talking about. So in ancient Greece, when Socrates arrived on the scene, we had a lot going on with the Sophists. And the chapter before the chapter on Socrates is about the Sophists. I didn't assign it, but I encourage you to read it if you find this particular explanation interesting. If you have the newest edition of the textbook, there's actually 2 chapters in between the Asian sages and Socrates. Pretty much everybody that was happening and talking about philosophy before then is all sort of lumped together as pre-Socratic. Literally just people before Socrates, because that's how much he was a game changer. He was definitely the grandfather of Western philosophy. So, the Sophists, there's not really a modern day equivalent of that sort of job or person, but it was sort of a combo between a teacher and a motivational speaker, maybe a little bit of like a lobbyist in there. These were people, there was no formalized education at any level. You had people that would learn basic skills from their parents. People would learn a lot in the military, and people would have a trade and they would learn directly from like as an intern or something like that. So the Sophists were people who were highly regarded as highly intelligent and educated, and they would wander around the ancient world and they would teach for money in public squares and town halls and whatever. And one of the things that Sophists were particularly interested in was the idea of change. Now, as you may recall, this was also a very popular concept and trouble in the Eastern ancient world. You had Lao Tzu, who concluded from this idea of everything constantly being in change that we had yin and yang, that were the relative union of opposites that were constantly changing back and forth and in flux, and our job was to try to remain balanced throughout that change. You had Buddha, who concluded that because everything was changing, that there is no self, because there's nothing which is you, which has always been you, which always will continue to be you, constantly. You're always changing. The Western philosophers were thinking about change as well. It just seems like everybody on the planet was simultaneously thinking about how to explain change. And I always really like when that happens. Everybody's kind of working on the same thing at the same time without knowing it. I like that. So what the Sophists concluded from this idea of change was that there really wasn't any knowledge. Because if I say that I know something, well, that's going to change. So I don't really know it, right? To say that I know something implies that it's always going to be constant. And if everything's changing, then nothing is constant. So I might think that I know that, right, that's the tallest mountain in the world. But what if the mountain collapses? What if there's, one that there's an earthquake and it gets bigger, right? Or maybe I just didn't know about one. Maybe I don't know that, right? Because it could change. I might think I know that there's this much water in the creek, but if it rained, there's going to be more. And if it's a drought, it's going to be less. Right? So how do I know anything if it's always changing? So the Sophists tended to conclude from this that everything was just a matter of opinion. And that there really wasn't any truth with a capital T. So this was sort of what was going on when Socrates arrived on the scene. And Socrates saw immediately how dangerous this way of looking at the world was. From one standpoint, it strikes us, I think, as intuitively wrong. So a lot of people used to think the earth was flat. Some people still do. But most people nowadays think it's some sort of spherical shape. And I'm sure there's a mixed bag of other things, right? Like, I'm sure there's somebody that thinks that it's shaped like, I don't know, a pyramid and, whatever. I'm sure there's other options. Now, this doesn't seem to be the sort of thing that we just want to say, like, well, it's all a matter of opinion, right? No, it seems like there's a fact of the matter on what shape the planet is, and some opinions are wrong, right? Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that we can conclude from that we have it right, right? That's not the same thing. But it's saying that there is knowledge about that, right? And that there are opinions about that, and that those aren't necessarily the same thing. So it seems instinctively wrong to say there's only opinion when you're talking about some sort of scientific fact, which back then neither of those words were things yet. We're going to see how that came about. But it seems even more dangerous to just go on the all opinion route when you're talking about something like morality. So you might have heard somebody say something like, well, it's true for me, but maybe it's not true for you. Right? And people think they're very open-minded and tolerant when they say things like this. And that's all well and good depending on what you're talking about. So, like, I might say, coffee is the best drink ever. Right now, that's maybe true for me because I really like coffee. Maybe you hate coffee. If you do, then it's not true for you that coffee is the best drink either, ever. I don't have a problem with something like that, but here's what I do have a problem with. Murdering and raping are okay for me. Maybe it's not okay for you to do that, but it's okay for me to do that. Right? I mean, that gets insane. You can't say that a serial killer is right in following his gut instincts and his opinions on whether or not serial killing is okay. Simply because a lot of Nazis thought that it was morally okay to commit mass genocide doesn't mean that it was right and that their opinion was just as valid as any other opinion about it. That's very dangerous territory, as you can hopefully see. So Socrates was really totally against this whole idea that it's just a matter of opinion. And a big part of what he was trying to do was to get that knowledge, to get that truth. And we're going to see how this carries on with Plato and then Aristotle as well in the same legacy. So Socrates was hideous. And it's said that he was so hideous that he was fascinating to people. You know how ugly you gotta be to be fascinating? Not only that, but we're talking about somebody who lived like 2,500 years ago. You know how ugly and interesting you've got to look for that to be part of your legacy? Like, I have no delusions. I'm not going to be remembered in 2,500 years, and who cares, right? I don't know why that's a goal for people to be remembered. Who cares? So, but even if I was remembered for something, I certainly hope that there wasn't like an addendum about my attractiveness or my physical appearance in that legacy, right? That just seems really weird that, that we're still talking about that. Especially this is before photographs. He never sat for a painting. Even the marble busts of him, and you see some pictures of that here, were created long, long after anybody that knew Socrates was dead, and they were just based loosely on random descriptions of him that we happen to find. So I think that's interesting. But Socrates had a fantastic sense of humor, and he was ironic, he was sarcastic, he made fun of himself and his appearance. You get this great story of him having a beauty contest with some super hot guy, and saying that he should win not because of the way his features looked, but because of how well they functioned, right? It seems like a very entertaining sort of a person. They can make fun of themselves and play around with their appearance for sure. That's not easy to do. So another interesting thing to note about Socrates is that he never wrote anything down. There's rumors that he wrote some poetry, but none of that survived. And he didn't write any of his philosophical ideas, any of his argument techniques, any of his ideas about the world. He didn't write any of that down. This is known as the Socratic problem. And the problem is, how do we know that Socrates actually was who we think he was? How do we know that he did and said what we think that he did and said if we don't have any of his records? Well, other people in the ancient world were talking about him, including Xenophon. Most of our information comes from Plato, who is the next philosopher to discuss. And all of Plato's ideas are expressed as conversations that Socrates is having with somebody else. These are known as dialogues. And how much of what Plato is writing about, how much of what other people are saying was actually what Socrates really said and did, how much of it was the man, the myth, the legend after the fact, and how much of it was Plato just telling us what he thought and using Socrates as the character. Great question. We're probably never going to know the answer to that because it was over 25 or almost 2,500 years ago, and that's just not something that we can necessarily prove now. However, ancient philosophy experts, ancient Greek historians tend to think that we can sort of segregate out and attribute certain things to Socrates and certain things to Plato. These are neither my areas of expertise, so I sort of go with what the experts are saying about that. But interesting to think about. So, Socrates was also sort of like a homeless drunk guy that wandered around and talked to people, which is kind of an interesting description for the grandfather of philosophy. This is Ginger, who's bugging me to come say hello. She has this ridiculous bow that the groomer put on her. But so, Socrates got in the habit of walking around and talking to people and challenging their beliefs and opinions. And if you've ever had that one friend who really likes to argue, but they really, really enjoyed proving everybody wrong way more than they enjoy trying to present their own viewpoint in a convincing way, that was sort of like Socrates. So you can maybe understand why a lot of people found him annoying, and a lot of people found him dangerous. And as you know, if you read the chapter. So Socrates walked around and talked to people, and a lot of people had the opposite opinion about him and thought that he was fantastic and thought that he was brilliant and viewed him as a teacher and a mentor and a role model and, you know, fantastic. And so he sort of developed this following of pupils or students who would listen to him as he engaged in debates and conversations and learn from him and emulate him. And then in the case of Plato, who was one of these students, go on to follow in his footsteps and to write about him and his legacy. So one of Socrates' friends went to an oracle. Now, an oracle in ancient Greece was an extremely important and highly regarded position that, again, we have no equivalent of nowadays. The oracles were the window between the average Greek citizen and the gods. And this is ancient Greece, so we're talking Zeus, Athena, Ares, all those guys. So people would go to the oracles if they had questions about what do I need to do to get forgiveness for this bad thing that I did? Is this the right thing for me to decide to do in the future? You know, what's the answer to this question? Right? They were viewed as being the source for information. So one of Socrates' buddies went to the oracle and asked, is any man wiser than Socrates? And the oracle came back and said, no man is wiser than Socrates. Now this could mean one of a few different things. First, that Socrates was incredibly wise and nobody else could touch him. It could mean that nobody was wise, including Socrates, but that Socrates was the best out of the bad situation. I mean, I guess technically it could mean that a woman was wiser, since that it was asked about what man, but I highly doubt that was what was intended, given the attitude historically on the intelligent capabilities and faculties of women. So when this news was brought back to Socrates, and the guy says, hey, Socrates, the oracle said no man is wiser than you. Now, the average person probably would let this completely go to their head, and their ego would explode, and, you know, the God said no man is wiser than me, right? That's pretty hardcore. Not Socrates. He was very humble about the whole thing. But you can't just straight up call the gods liars, right? That's a dangerous game to play. So instead, Socrates decided, well, I'm just going to find somebody who's wiser than I am, and then I can go to the gods and say, look, you said no one was wiser than me, but clearly this person knows way more than I do. Right? Socrates never claimed to know anything. So it sort of caught him off guard that the oracle would say no man was wiser than him. So he set it on this mission to try to find somebody who was wiser than he was. And his first stop was a politician. I suspect times have changed, and if your task was to find the wisest person in America, something tells me you probably wouldn't start with a politician. Just saying. The politician claimed to have it all figured out, told Socrates about wisdom and justice and all sorts of things. And Socrates quickly learned this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And he's got all the arrogance, but nothing to back it up. It can't hold up to scrutiny and questioning, also known as the Socratic method. Coming back to that. So then Socrates went to a poet. Also an interesting choice to us now to go to find the wisest person is to go to a poet. And then he went to some sophists and other people that had this reputation for wisdom and intelligence. And he came to the same conclusion every time. So at the end of his sort of journey, I mean, I guess not the end of it because he continued to talk to people his whole life, but at the end of this sort of journey to find somebody wiser than himself, he sort of concluded this. Okay, look, like, I'm not wise. I have no idea what's going on. But neither does anybody else. And they all think that they know. They think they have the answers, and they're confident that they've got it all figured out. But they don't. They're just as ignorant as I am. So if I have any advantage over them in the wisdom department, it's only because I acknowledge and understand my ignorance. And they don't. So you have this combination of self-righteousness combined with ignorance, which is always a volatile combination, even to this day. So Socrates concluded from that, it's not that I'm wise, it's just that at least I know that I don't know anything, right? So this is one of the most famous quotes from Socrates that you've probably heard at some point in your life, which is, all that I know is that I know nothing. Now, he meant this very literally. Socrates didn't mean something like, oh, there's so much knowledge in the world and I only know so little of it. I don't know anything in the grand scheme of life. No. He meant literally, I know nothing. Because for him, and for most philosophers, as we'll see, knowledge is a pretty serious thing, right? It's not like saying, I know that the Cubs are going to win the World Series again, right? You don't know that. Right? That's wishful thinking, for sure. Although, I don't know, I could have used the same example last year. So, knowledge is something that requires proof. And Socrates was always trying to find that proof. So here was his methodology, which if you take a speech and debate class, forensics class, anything like that, you're probably going to learn this methodology, sometimes also known as the Socratic dialectic, because it's still a really effective way to argue. So here's what he would do. You have a great example of this about justice, which is from the Republic, which I hope you enjoyed in this chapter. So here's basically what Socrates would do. He would go up to people and first he would butter them up. And he would say, oh, you're so wise. Will you please share your infinite wisdom and information, intelligence with, I'm just so ignorant, stupid. I really want to learn from you. Please share your wisdom with me. Now, the reason for this was because if you butter somebody up before you're trying to criticize them, they're going to be a lot more open and honest about their beliefs because they're going to feel, you're going to inflate their ego, you're going to make them feel confident in what they believe, you're going to make them feel like they're going to teach you and you're just going to be in adoration the whole time, agreeing with whatever they say, and they're going to be a lot more open and honest. If you come at somebody and you say, tell me what you believe about this, I'm going to prove you wrong, they're going to be way more guarded in what they're going to say. And the more guarded and vague somebody is, the harder it is to criticize because they're not actually saying anything. There's a reason that every politician on the nomination, whatever campaign trail at pretty much every level of politics says some generic, vague BS about the children are our future and we're going to invest in the future, right? And everybody cheers because nobody's going to be like, boo, screw kids, right? But what they don't say is, here's what I mean by that. Here's the amount of funding that I'm going to put into these specific school programs, and here's where the money's going to come from, and here's the timeline of exactly how I'm going to do it, and here's the results that I expect to get as out of it. If you do that, I can attack any part of that plan, right? It's a lot easier to criticize when you lay it all out. So Socrates would butter them up into this false sense of security, and then he would ask them a question like, what is justice? What is beauty? What is the good? And these seem like really weird questions to us now because most people don't ask questions like this anymore. And what he meant wasn't, give me a list of things that are beautiful, give me examples of justice, right? Tell me some good things. No, he was saying, like, what is justice in and of itself? What does that mean? What is beauty? If I say something is beautiful, what does that mean? What is beauty itself? These are not easy questions to ask or to answer. So people would give them their definition, right? Justice is, whatever. So then Socrates would start asking questions. And first, he would repeat their answer back to them, right? He'd say, so you're saying that justice is, doing whatever's in the best interest of the people in charge, right? As an example. He would repeat it back to them, and he would make them define any potentially ambiguous words or phrases until he had a very precise, clear, and concise, and thorough explanation. And he would repeat it back to them and say, so you're saying that justice is, and he would repeat their claim back to them until they agreed to it. And then he would start to ask questions. And this is a brilliant debate tactic because everybody's had that discussion where you're interacting with somebody and then you feel like you've got them in a corner and then all of a sudden they start pulling, oh, well, that's not what I meant, right? You took it out of context, right? Now they're playing like the backup game. You get them to agree to everything spelled out before you even start to question or criticize so that they can't do that later and go back and say, well, that's not what I meant. So then Socrates would start asking questions. And at first they seemed kind of unrelated and like really obvious questions. And then they'd say, okay, yeah, I agree with that. Okay, yeah, I agree with that. And he would keep asking questions, and eventually it would lead back to a contradiction of what their original answer was. And they never saw it coming. It seemed like. And that was it, right? Like, so he would basically show them this contradiction. He would basically, without saying it, say, like, look, you have no idea what you're talking about. Clearly that's not the right answer. And then he'd, like, walk away, right? Socrates didn't stick around and say, well, here's what I think, right? And people a lot of times got mad at him about this. And they said, oh, you can't walk around and just tell everybody that they're wrong and offer no solution, right? And he would say, of course I can. I don't think that I know the answer. The whole reason I was here is because you said that you did have the answer. And you clearly don't. I'm not claiming that I know what the answer is, right? All that I know is that I know nothing. And neither does anybody else. Now, a lot of people didn't like this. And not even just from like a mild annoyance standpoint, but he got arrested, right? So he was charged with corrupting the youth of Athens and speaking against the gods. These were both things that you could get arrested for. Let that sink in, and let's appreciate the freedoms that we do have for a moment. I would be in jail for sure, just given the nature of my job, right? So he was arrested and put on trial. You have a lot about it in here. We're going to see more about it with Plato because he wrote extensively about the trial of Socrates. But the way that this whole thing went down is you essentially had two options when you had charges like this leveled against you. You could exile yourself. So you could essentially say, like, yeah, I did it. It was wrong. My bad. I'm just going to leave. And then you would leave Athens and you could spend the rest of your life wherever else in the ancient world you wanted, doing whatever else you wanted to do. And you just couldn't go back to Athens. Obviously, most people chose this option because the second option was death if you got found guilty by the mob. Now, interesting thing about the death penalty in ancient Greece, they made you kill yourself. That's worth thinking about and talking about, right? If you're a proponent of the death penalty, I think that's interesting. So these were the options. So obviously, most people didn't want to take their chances with the mob and end up dying. So they would just exile themselves. Well, instead of saying, oh yeah, sorry, I'm just going to leave, Socrates, who was already pretty old at this point, especially for back then, instead of just exiling himself, he went up and gave this whole speech about how he was actually the only person that was helping the youth of Athens, and that everybody else was corrupting them because nobody else knew what they were talking about, and he was the one actually giving them discernible skills and tools to become intelligent citizens. And he suggested that they put him up in the equivalent of like a 5-star resort, which is where all of like the Olympic champions and like the best warriors and visiting diplomats and stuff. He suggested that they put him up there and like essentially give him free food for the rest of his life. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. He got found guilty, sentenced to kill himself by drinking hemlock, which is the poisonous bark of a tree. He actually sat in jail for a couple of weeks, which was uncommon. Normally they had you kill yourself right away and try to make it as efficient as possible. But there was some sort of holy festival going on and they weren't allowed to do it. And so he kept sort of teaching from jail his disciples, and their disciples is the wrong word, pupils, students, whatever, including Plato, by his side. And even the guards of the jail took a liking to him and learned from him, and on more than one occasion supposedly left his cell open and were like, okay, we're going to leave. If you happen to run away, we won't chase you. Right? But he didn't. He stayed. He didn't exile himself and he didn't run away because he didn't want to admit that what he was doing was wrong because he didn't think that it was wrong. He wasn't going to say, I'm sorry, I corrupted the youth. I'm just going to leave. Because to him, he really believed that he was helping the youth and he really believed in justice. And he didn't want to believe that the courts would fail him. So he is around all of his students. It's finally time. They give him the hemlock cocktail, and all the men are crying, and he makes some jab about, I sent the women away because I didn't want anybody to cry, it's fine. He drinks the hemlock as the poison is entering his system. Supposedly his last words were, oh, I owe so-and-so a chicken, make sure that they get it, lights out. Essentially the first martyr for philosophy. Right? People die for religion. People die for political causes. He was the first and one of the only people, thankfully, who died for philosophy. And obviously his legacy lives on. Now, it's up to you whether or not you think that that was an effective way to go out, or whether you think he should have just gotten the heck out of Athens and spread his good message elsewhere. Is up to you, for sure. Plato's dialogue, The Apology, deals extensively with Socrates' trial. It's not that long. You can probably find it online if you're interested. And it's not called The Apology because he apologized, because he didn't. Apology also in the ancient Greek means defense. So it was basically Socrates' defense of his behavior. Now, one of the only other things that I really want to point out here about Socrates was his idea about the examined life, right? This is one of the most famous quotes in the entire history of philosophy. An unexamined life is not worth living. Now, I think that's one of those things that if you say that to most people, they probably say, yeah, I agree with that. But most people don't actually live that way. Excuse me. Whether it's because they don't understand what he meant or because they don't really want to take the time to do that. But Socrates basically means that if you go through life just sort of accepting everything at face value, if you accept what you're told by your parents and your society and your government and your media and your religion and, your neighbors and, whatever else, if you just accept what people tell you and you never really question that, and then also yourself, right? Like if you never really take the time to investigate and understand yourself, if sometimes I'll notice that somebody has some sort of reaction. Like, did you realize that every time, right, we talk about this, you react this way? And a lot of people say, oh no, I never knew that. And then they'll never really think about that. And to me, that always is fascinating, that people are totally content not understanding something about the way that they operate. Right? Like, oh, I don't really need to spend time digging in and wondering about that. Right? Like, oh, that's just how I am. Right? Didn't you ever wonder why? Right? I mean, I'm a curious person in general, so it's hard for me when other people aren't curious. So it's no wonder that I found a field like philosophy where the whole thing is curiosity. But so the unexamined life is not worth living. Now, people tend to get defensive sometimes when you say this, like, who is he to tell me if my life is worth living? Of course you're right. But on the other hand, it's sort of like, you ever go to a movie and, like, people talk the whole time, or they're on their cell phone the whole time, and they're clearly not paying attention to the movie at all. And it's sort of like, why did you even bother to pay, right? Like, movies are expensive now. Like, why did you bother to pay all this money to come here and see this movie, and then you're not even paying attention, right? Like, it's not worth a $12 whatever movie ticket to not even try to watch the movie. I think it's more like that, right? Like, clearly you have the right to go to a movie and screw around on your phone and not care. But, I mean, why is that worth it? Right? I think it's the same thing about life. Like, surely you're entitled to live however you want, but why is it worth it, right? Like, you've been given this fascinating brain, this fascinating life full of mystery and wonder, and then you're just like, no, I'm good, right? Like, whatever people told me when I was 5, like that, right? I'm good. It doesn't seem like it's worth it, right? You're not taking full advantage of all life has to offer, and at least learn about what your other possibilities are and explore that before you settle on your own answers, right? So examine your life, right? That's a pretty big challenge. Now, we'll hear a little bit more about Socrates and his ideas and viewpoints when we talk about Plato, but I hope you enjoyed learning about Socrates. And let me know if you want any other recommendations of things to read about him.